Let's get started.
On
So,
time.
today I wanted to talk about how we teach yoga without demonstrating.
Yeah.
And so, if you're already teaching, you might have already come across this. If you're not quite teaching yet, this is something to keep in mind and maybe even to start to practice. There will be times for many reasons where you're not going to be able to demonstrate, or you're not going to want to demonstrate, or you're not going to want to demonstrate every pose in your class. And that might come up because of injury or disability or recovery. Maybe you're dealing with fatigue, or if you're teaching a lot of yoga, sometimes you can start to feel some repetitive strain. And so you might want to back off of your demonstrating a little bit. Sometimes when you're teaching outdoors, or in a really large venue, it can be hard to demonstrate and stay in poses and demonstrate and be able to see all your students and get your voice across to all of your students. So that might be a time when you reduce your demonstrations. You might want to be moving around the room more, offering props, offering support. So staying at the front of the class and demonstrating is less effective in that environment. You might not be able to demonstrate certain poses. So, you might have a sinus infection, for instance, and going upside down can be really painful. In my experience, one time I was teaching in the evening after I'd been to the beach all day, and I couldn't go upside down because I didn't even know this could happen. This was early on in my life in Australia. Water kept coming out my nose because I got dumped in the waves earlier that day. And every time I went upside down, the water that I'd taken in during the day kept coming out. So I couldn't go upside down for that yoga class. So there can be a lot of reasons why you're not going to demonstrate, or you don't want to demonstrate your whole class. And it might even just be that you want to develop some of your other teaching strategies. Often, when we begin teaching yoga, we really rely on our demonstrating to both instruct the pose to our students, but also to help us to bring cues and instructions out of our own bodies. So rather than having all your cues in your head, often you've got them in your body. And so when you're moving physically through a practice, it's helping you to provide verbal instructions as well as those physical cues to your students. At some point, you might decide that you want to develop those cueing strategies or other physical cues and demonstrate a little bit less. So those are all the reasons why you might want to experiment with how to teach yoga without demonstrating. When you do this, whether it's your class or maybe you're subbing a class or teaching a specialty class, you might introduce the idea to your students that you're going to be demonstrating less. And you don't have to explain why if you don't want to. You can just say something like, I'm going to be demonstrating a little less than I usually do. Or if you're subbing a class, I'm going to be demonstrating maybe a little less than you're used to today. So stay tuned to my cues, right? And that's all you have to say. You don't necessarily have to explain yourself, especially if your reasons for not demonstrating are personal and something that you don't want to share. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? So what are some strategies that you could use to use physicality or use your cues to get across the details of a pose, to instruct people safely into and out of the pose with breath without demonstrating the whole pose? And one way is what I'm doing right now, gesturing. So using physical gestures to get across the pose. And if you've ever been to like fitness classes, like group fitness, you'll see that those instructors have a really great way of using their arms for legs and their hands for feet to indicate what you should be doing. So we'll take, for example, something like wide leg forward fold. Instead of me moving into the pose, I can use my arms to indicate, let's step our feet nice and wide. So taking your hands out wide, and then turn your feet slightly in. So I'm using my hands to tell people what to do with their feet. And that's really useful, especially if you're teaching in a really big space or you've got a really big class and you're wanting to reach the people at the back of the room to understand what they might not see at the front of the room, what's happening with your feet, right? So using your arms to indicate what someone's going to do with their legs, using your hands to indicate what they might do with their feet. You could imagine that kind of strategy is also useful for things like triangle and side angle, stepping your feet out wide, turn your right foot out 90 degrees, turn your left foot in 30 degrees. And that's a way for you to demonstrate and use physical cues and give people that visual input without you demonstrating the pose. So that's one strategy. One you want to add to your teaching toolbox, right? And just to try it out and see how it works for you, but also to introduce the idea to your students that you might not always be using your whole body to teach a pose. You can also use strategies like tapping body parts. If you're talking about a particular body part and you're not able to, or you're not wanting to move that body part, tapping it gives people an idea. So even if we're talking about a really subtle adjustment like collarbones, tapping your collarbones and doing maybe a little bit of a gesture of let's widen and soften your collarbones. Or, you know, if your hands are feeling tight, let's soften them out. So just using little physical gestures that gives people a sense that they're getting that visual input, but they're not having to see you in the whole pose, right? Also doing semi-demos. So that might be like half doing a pose, or it might be entering into a pose or moving on your way into a pose, just to get your students started and then backing out of the pose and letting them stay there. Now, before we get into the details of that, for those of you who are already teaching, you might have noticed that when you do demonstrate a lot, or when you're working with students who are really accustomed to demonstrating, they will copy every move that you make. So if you start to go into a pose and then back out, they'll back out. So you may have to, I see you nodding there, son. You may have to cue them. You keep going, I'm going to take a break. Or you stay there, I'm going to come out. Just so that they know that while they've been in the rhythm of following your body, now they need to stop following your body and start following your cues, right? So if we take a pose like downward facing dog, which is one that I often recommend we don't stay in to cue, you can enter into your downward facing dog, tell your students to stay there, you're coming out, drop your knees to the ground, and then you can look around, right? You don't have to stay in that pose. That semi-demo not only allows you, especially if you've got something going on with wrists or elbows or shoulders or sinuses, whatever, it allows you to come out of the pose and keep your body comfortable. And for the benefit of your students, it allows you to look around the room and see what's happening. And then your refining cues, your safety cues, your corrective cues are going to be much more appropriate to what's happening. You're not just going to be throwing cues out into the world. You're going to see what's going on with your students, and you're going to be able to cue appropriately to what they're experiencing. And that might include offering refining cues, making some prop suggestions, making some suggestions for regressions or progressions. And you'll know that because you see it happening. Otherwise, if you stay in downward facing dog, your head's down, your voice is going into your chest, and there can be a sense, especially in that pose, of disconnection. There's the teacher in her or his pose, and here I am in mine, and I'm not even hearing what they're saying to me anymore. Any thoughts on that? It's an interesting transition when you're used to doing a lot of demonstrating to not demonstrating at all. And I know in my own transition, in my own teaching, I used to demonstrate a lot. And then I started having, I live with a chronic pain condition. So I started having a lot more pain, and eventually got to the point where I just couldn't be demonstrating classes the whole way through. It wasn't safe for me. And it definitely wasn't demonstrating the principles of yoga for me to be hurting myself to teach yoga, right? But the transition was really challenging because I was so used to using my body to communicate. Found it really hard to make that transition into not demonstrating as much. And that's where I started using a lot more physical cues. So say I was teaching like, do you teach hundreds? And you're plotting. So say I'm teaching hundreds. I don't have to be on the floor to teach hundreds. I can talk about curling up off the floor. I can talk about the head nod. Like I could do all of this with gesture. I can talk about pulsing the arms. I can do all of that stuff standing. And so I'm not having to be on the ground in the pose. And also it gives you that chance to get that 360-degree view of your students. So then your cues are targeted towards what's happening now, rather than what do I remember about this pose? What else can I say? Because those cues are often less useful, right? And using that kind of semi-demo helped me get over the craving. Is that the right word? I feel like it is. The craving to get on the mat and just demonstrate it. That was a really big step for me, a really big challenge, because I am so used to using my body to communicate my thoughts, right? Years and years of teaching yoga. So that's an interesting transition. So when we think about making a transition from a lot of demoing to maybe less demoing, know that it's not just a transition for your students to learn how to hear you more and maybe see you less, but it's also a transition for you to learn how to communicate without using your whole body or being in the whole pose. And that can be challenging, right? Yeah, and I mean, keep in mind that you've really developed your teaching skills and strategies. You've also really developed confidence in teaching movement. So any new movement styles that you add on now, you're adding to a very full teaching toolbox and lots of experience, right? For new teachers, often we do rely a lot more on our bodies to draw out our cues and to instruct. And so you can think of it for many people as a kind of maturing of your teaching skills to be able to teach without demonstrating, that pose can live in your body without you having to do it. And then your cues can come out from that, right?
Yes.
So if you're listening and you're a brand new teacher, or you're a teacher in training, you're thinking, how will I instruct without being in the pose? You know, I'm in Warrior 2. That's how I know what to tell people to do with their body. That's okay. That's a great place to start with your teaching strategies. And that's a place many of us start. And it's a place that our students often really rely on. And then you'll continue to develop your teaching strategies from there, right? And you'll be, you know, over time, perhaps be able to teach more without demonstrating. Demonstrating is really key for your students. You know, especially if you've got people with any kind of sense difference, you know, hearing difficulties, maybe any language barriers, maybe they can't hear you because you're teaching in such a big room. They'll really rely on your physical body. And also people who are accustomed to that. So maybe people who've been going to yoga for a long time or doing fitness classes for a long time, they're really used to being instructed with physical cues. And so it can be a transition to having to listen more and watch less. What I like about that transition, what I think is interesting about it, is that I find often when I'm really over reliant on demonstrating, my students' eyes are on me the whole time. So they're in down dog, but their necks are craned and they're looking at what I'm doing. And they're in cobra up dog and their heads turned to the side, watching what I'm doing. And that's maybe not great alignment. And it's maybe, I get a sense that that's a lot of attention and awareness going out to what I'm doing, which can be really useful. You know, we're teaching from body to body when we're teaching yoga. But if students can rely a little bit less on watching me and a little bit more on watching their own bodies, maybe that helps them bring some energy inward, right? And bring their attention inward. And one of the ways that we can do that is by demonstrating a little bit less. And another way we can do that is by asking questions or getting students to inquire into their own body. So rather than them watching what your body is doing, they're watching what their own body is doing. So, you know, even just highlighting points of alignment, you know, our common points of alignment, you know, can you see your hip and knee and second toe in alignment, right? And I'm using a gesture to point that out, right? And then they can look down and go, oh, there's my body. What's it doing, right? Or, you know, having your knee stacked over your heel. Can you see that? And it gets them looking at their own body, communicating with their own body. And I think that's an interesting experience for a lot of people who might not take that time to be with their body in that way. And that's a role that yoga can play in their lives, that to get to know your body and get to know where it is in space, developing, you know, proprioception, where is my body in space? And also things like interoception, what's happening inside my body? What are my inner sensations? And this is just Heather's random theory. I don't know if this, you know, is actually true for everyone, but my sense is that taking all that attention away from the teacher and turning some of that attention into my own body, I feel like that gives people a richer experience of yoga. And maybe even encouraging students to move their bodies more outside of class, right? That as they rely less on you being there to instruct and demonstrate every movement, maybe they'll develop more confidence to move on their own. So maybe they'll do some warm-ups at home, or they'll do a few of their favorite stretches in bed, or, you know, maybe they'll be excited to roll out their mat and do some sun salutations. When we put the ownership and the empowerment in the student's hands, rather than keeping it all in, I've got to be here in order for you to do yoga because you need me to demonstrate all of this, right? So let's talk a little bit more about semi-demos. So in semi-demos, you're sort of moving into part of the pose. You're going to demonstrate some part of the pose, and then maybe you'll let your students know you're coming out, and they can stay in, and then you come out so you can view and cue, right? What are some examples of poses where you've seen a teacher do that, or you've done that yourself, or where you think you might be able to do that? We've talked about downward facing dog. So kind of shifting into the pose, letting students know they can stay there, coming out and looking around the room. What are some other poses where you might employ this strategy? Sidearm balance?
Yeah.
So you demonstrate some version of sidearm balance, and then do you stand up or do you stay on your mat? That might relate to a lot of our balancing poses, where to hold a balance and look around the room might mean that you're less balanced than you would be in your own personal practice. And because students' eyes are on you, when you're wobbling around in balancing poses, it can cause them to wobble.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana, extended standing hand to big toe pose, or big balance, you might just use gesture for that, or you might semi-demo, get into the pose, tell them to hold it, you come out, and now you can be stable and still and look around the room and view and cue, right? Or you might just use gesture. You know, you might do the first couple of versions of the pose, to the toe tip, hands to the knee, and then you might just use your hand. If it's available, you can catch your big toe, and then your feet go to the ground and they stay in their pose. And now you're steady and still in balance so that you can provide some support, right? In the example of Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana, extended hand to big toe pose, if you're teaching ABC, you can continue to use your arm for a leg, right? So both of my feet are on the ground. My students have their legs up in the air. I can cue, let's rotate the inner thigh to the ceiling a little bit. And then let's take that leg out to the side. I don't have to use my leg for that. I can use my arm and then turn the head to the opposite side. When it comes to C, bring the leg back to the center. So all of that can be done with gesture and semi-demo rather than holding the pose, right? Yeah. And that's not only useful for you, because if you haven't been demonstrating through the whole class, it's hard to be warm enough to really safely enter into that pose, especially if you're tighter in the hamstrings. You won't have that warmth. And it's also useful for your students to have you more static rather than. That's a really good example, son, of sidearm balance, or any of our balancing poses might be a place where we use gestures or where we use semi-demos rather than being in the whole pose. Yeah. Another example. What other pose might you see this working? So what are you envisaging here? Just using gesture to take the feet out, or you're going to step out into the pose and then you stay there, I'm going to come out? There is one small problem that I've definitely faced over the years is once I'm out of a pose, I can lose track of how challenging a pose is and how many breaths they've been in.
True.
If for those of you who've studied with me, you might have noticed this. So having some kind of timer in your head of how long have they been holding this pose for? But especially, in terms of Warrior 2, if you've got a lot of students really leaning, you can be walking around the room, cueing, moving hand to hand with students to help them, push back up to alignment in the pose. Like, those are all things that can be really, really useful and create a greater personal connection, between you and your students when you're able to do that. And you can't do that if you're just demonstrating from the front of the class. Exactly. Having that hand-to-hand or physical contact, which many of us haven't had much contact over the last couple of years, that can be really nice. And to do that, you've got to get out of the pose. And so again, part of that is training your students that you're not going to stay in a pose the whole time. So, saying, you stay there, I'm going to come out and help. You might even, if you're offering hands-on support, if anyone needs help, wave a hand in the air, and then you can move around to that student. And so they're not reliant on you being an anchor at the front of the class demonstrating every pose. It does free you up to move around. You just, try not to hold them for 10 breaths in Warrior like some teachers do. That takes practice. A lot of practice. But yeah, the Warriors is a great place to use semi-demo, get out, move around, and help. What other poses might we see this a useful strategy? Lying down poses, because your voice, it's hard to get your voice, especially if you've got a bigger class, when you're lying down. It's hard to get your voice to students, and you can't see what's going on. And often they can't see you. Anything lying down. So that might include something like bridge. It might be any of our reclining poses. So reclining staff, reclining forward fold, fish, all of those poses, you might demo and then get out, or you might stand to teach through those poses so that you can use gesture and semi-demo and keep an eye on your students. And the benefit of that is you can see really clearly when your cues aren't landing, or when they need extra support, or when they might need a prop or an offer of a regression or a progression. When you're on your back on the mat, it's really hard to see any of that, right? So any of our lying down poses is a great place to use either gesture, so stay standing, use your arms and your hands for demonstrating, or demo and then get out, right? In my own life, I will mention that getting up off the ground for me has become less elegant, shall we say? It's a little bit harder because I have an ankle that doesn't move. It's harder for me to get up and down as quickly as I used to. So I do tend, in the lying down poses, for that reason, I do tend to stay standing so that I'm not getting up and down over and over again. Also, you don't need to know all this, but I have a dizziness thing. So for those of you who have low blood pressure or POTS or something like that, the getting up and down can be a little bit difficult on your body, and it can also be really distracting to your teaching. So you might decide, based on if you have any of those factors, to stay standing to teach those poses, And if you have ease getting up and down off the ground, you have that option as well. So lying down pose is great option. Also things like child's pose, they don't need you to be, I know it's really nice, especially if you've had a long day, you're teaching an evening class, but don't stay in child's pose. They can't hear anything you're saying in there, and you can't see what's going on around the room. So when it's poses where your face is turned into your body or your eyes are turned into your body, those are great places to use a semi-demo and then get out of the pose, right? Yeah. Another way that you can demonstrate without demonstrating is demonstrating from a chair. Or if you don't have a chair available, especially if you're teaching in a gym, you might have Swiss balls. Do we still call it, big fitness balls? You could be seated through your whole class and teach the full class. You can teach sun salutations seated. You can teach your warriors sitting in a chair. You can teach all your seated forward folds. So if you've got something going on that's preventing you from standing, moving through the practice, or maybe you've got a student in your class, you're teaching an accessible class, and you've got a student or two who are in a chair, it's nice to demonstrate to those students, and the students who are not on a chair can follow along with what you're doing on their mat, right? Any thoughts on that before I ramble on in that direction? Often, what I find is when we're teaching accessible classes or when we're moving in the direction of greater accessibility, often I see teachers teaching the traditional pose or the full pose and then talking about accessible options, and which is fine. But for people who are using accessible options, it not only helps them see the pose as an accessible pose, so a standing pose practiced on a chair, or a sun salutation practiced on the wall, or etc. It not only helps them see that, to have those visual cues, it also kind of validates the technique. The teacher's doing it, so it's cool, right? I can do it too. If the teacher never demonstrates using props, if the teacher never demonstrates regressions or accessible options, do you feel like there's an undercurrent of, look, I'm going to give you these options, but this is the real thing to do, right? So if you regularly use accessible versions of poses, use the props, use the wall, sit on the chair, it helps students see that that's also yoga, that this is a sun salutation standing on the mat. This is a sun salutation against the wall. This is a sun salutation in the chair. And it kind of makes accessible yoga more accessible, right? And more acceptable in your class. So it might not just be for your benefit that you're seated in a chair or seated on a Swiss ball while you have an injury or a disability, or you're recovering, or you're tired. It also is going to really help to support your students who might also benefit from those options at some stage or throughout the life of their practice. Do you think there's any times where you have to demonstrate, where demonstrating is more beneficial or more useful or safer than cueing? That beginners tend to really rely on what we're physically doing.
Yeah.
We take for granted the multitude of things we're doing in any yoga pose. But if you wind yourself back to being a beginner, do you remember how confusing it was? Especially something complex like sun salutation. I remember just we're moving and this and this and this. And so we can really benefit from having someone's physical cues and physical demonstrations in a beginner's class. So that's a really good point, Naomi. Beginners classes, you might be demonstrating a lot more. because there's more poses, so, and it's so pacey, so there's actually less time to give instructions.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So a physical instruction or a demonstration is the quickest way to get across the pose, because it's complex, because it's so pacey. I would agree. Sometimes in vinyasa flow classes, and especially for people who are newer to vinyasa flow, it could be the easiest and most efficient way to get across what's happening. And then if you want to train your students to rely less on your demonstrations, you could teach, a couple of sun salutations and then not demonstrate the next two, right? So, okay, we're going to do 2 more rounds. I'll talk you through it. And then students are relying less on seeing you and more on what's happening in here. And the great thing about that is you're starting to train them to rely less on your demos, but also they're starting to remember what sun salutations are. If you stretch your mind back to when you were a beginner, I remember the moment when I understood sun salutations. I'd gone to a couple classes. I was like, what? And they're always changing. And there's this one and there's this one and what's going on. And then one day I was just like, I know these things. I know where to go next. I figured this thing out. And it was so empowering that I learned this thing that I now carried with me that I could go and do whenever I wanted to do. So giving students a chance to rely less on you and more on their own memory, that can be a really useful way to not just instruct yoga, but to educate people in yoga so that now they own the practice, right? So yeah, you might find that at the start of a class, where it's more pacey, there's a lot more flows, things like our warm-ups, our sun salutations, you might be demonstrating a little bit more. And then when we come to strengthening movements, seated poses, restorative poses, you might be needed less in demonstrating. And so you have more ability to move around the room or to stand on your mat and view and cue. So that's a really good point, Naomi. Are there any other situations where you think demoing might be the safest or most effective or efficient option? So if you're teaching to people who speak different languages from you, there's any kind of language barrier, or if you're teaching to people who have any kind of hearing impairment, your demos can be essential for them to be able to understand what's happening in a yoga class, right? And then your cues for people who don't see as well, or for people who have vision impairment. So that's, combining those in any environment where you've got people who have any kind of sense impairment, or there's any kind of language barrier, that can be really useful, right? And not just demonstrating, but also using all those other strategies like gestures and tapping. So here I'm talking about shoulders, and shoulders go down, right? And so that can be really useful anytime you're not speaking the same language as all of your students. I remember going to classes in Japan, and I don't speak Japanese, but I knew everything that was going on because the teacher was demonstrating. So I was able to really enjoy yoga classes in a language that I didn't speak, and that's due to their use of physical cues. Any other environments where you might use or not use demos? So this is a really great point, and this is where the tell, show, do strategy can be really useful. And that might be for beginners, or it might be for your advancing students who are transitioning from beginner or less regular students, and they're advancing their practice. The tell, show, do strategy is first tell them what you're going to do, and then show them what they're going to do, and then they do what they're going to do, right? So often, if you think about a vinyasa flow class, we're doing tell, show, do. We're doing it all at once. We're telling, we're showing, they're doing. Everything's happening at once. But sometimes it's useful to break that down and say, let's pause for a moment. Next, we're going to do this transition. And I just want to workshop a couple of ideas about the transition. So here's what we're going to do. Step 1, 2, 3. And then let me show you what that looks like for a moment. And then you demo it. And then they do it. So they've had the verbal information, they've gotten the physical cues, and now they can do the thing without having to watch or listen quite so much. And I
Mhm.
think that's a really great strategy for introducing new components or new transitions or new versions of poses
Mhm.
where you think, I want to make sure students are ready and they understand, what muscles they're going to be using, where their breath is going to be, what the rhythm and timing is. So that's a really useful strategy. Tell, show, do in those circumstances. Sorry, I'm rambling on here, but so often we spend a lot of our time talking about poses, but we do want to remember that transitions are their own asanas, right? And that just as important as it is to safely guide people in this pose, we want to think about how we're going to consciously and with breath transition from this pose to the next pose. So that's another asana in itself that you can think about. Um, and as a teacher, often those transitions are a little bit hard on your body because you're not breathing well. You're maybe not using the best alignment when you're demonstrating. If I'm going from up dog to down dog and I'm looking at my students over here, that's not great alignment. So using the tell, show, do strategy can be safer for you as well, so that you have a chance to talk and then demo and then they do it, right? For those of you who are teaching a lot or who plan to be teaching a lot, that's especially important. Because if you think about back in the day, I used to teach somewhere between 5 and 8 classes some days. And often I would demonstrate a lot more on the first side of a pose, especially asymmetrical poses, and then less on the second side. So if we think about triangle, right? So I'm going to demonstrate triangle and hang out the pose for a couple extra breaths, talk about a couple things, then come out, talk to the students, guide them out, and then guide them into the second side. But they know what they're doing now from the first side. So then I go into the second side. Okay, so we're going to triangle and you stay there and I'll come out and I move around and I cue, etc. And then side angle. I demonstrate lots and lots on this side. I demonstrate less on this side. And then rotated side angle. Demonstrate lots and lots on this side, less on this side. And so it goes through a whole class. You do that 3, 5, 8 times a day. That starts to create a lot of imbalance in your own body. Can you imagine? So thinking about, for the sake of your own body, trying to balance the demonstrating from one side to another, trying to balance your demonstrating of like forward folds and back bends. If you're always demonstrating forward folds and never demonstrating back bends, is that creating a little bit of imbalance in your body? Something that either can be addressed in your own practice or maybe something to think about, balancing out how you demo and how you use your body in class. This is important, but maybe less vital if you're teaching 1 or 2 or 3 classes a week. But if you're teaching multiple times a day, it really might be something for you to think about in order to keep your body healthy and safe and balanced and reduce the risk of repetitive strain. So we talked about why you might not demonstrate. We talked about how you might not demonstrate. Are there any final thoughts about teaching yoga without demonstrating or with less demonstrating? Yeah, there's a couple of examples of that I'll give. And lion face is an excellent example of that. Falling out breath is a good example of that because students don't know that they're allowed to make noise in a yoga class. So if you're guiding the falling out breath and just say, take a deep breath in and then sigh out your breath, they'll go, ah. But if you get dramatic about it, take a deep breath in, sigh out the breath, it gives them permission to make noise in class.
Yeah.
And that noise is great for doing what we want falling out breaths to do, relaxing the belly, relaxing the throat, relaxing the jaw, right? So that's a really good place where demos are important. Um, there was another one in my brain. Oh yeah, things like happy baby pose. And to you, it might feel like a totally ordinary thing to do, like lying on your back if you're not familiar with Happy Baby, and your legs are out wide and you're bringing your hands down. And that can be a really vulnerable position, especially if you're teaching in certain environments, like corporate environments. So you demonstrating it first makes it an acceptable thing to do, right? So that's an excellent point, Naomi. Thank you for that. Yeah, anything that you see your students are hesitating to do, you can do it, and you can do it dramatically. And that make all the difference. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for being here today. Thank you to those of you who are here live and for your great contributions to the discussion. Much appreciated. Hello to those of you listening to the recording. I can't remember what's on the list for next week, but if you do have ideas or requests for future discussions, please do send me an email. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.